I'll sit behind this end. Okay. Well, mine's a little bit different. My family doesn't go back to this town very long. My father came here in 1930 because he was the manager of the A&P store. And at that time, but then he got married, and I was born in 1940. And I moved here, so I'm told, because I don't remember a thing about it, when I was 4 months old. We lived on Hood Street, which was right off of, across from the old firehouse. And there was a double house there that at that time belonged to Robert and Amanda Burdett. And Happy and Louise Albright lived in the west side of it, or the north, or the far side of it, and we lived in the side toward Main Street. One of the things that I remember early on was that I needed to get home from school because Happy had one of the first TVs in Mt Airy. And if I didn't watch Howdy Doody at 5 and Hopalong Cassidy at 5:30, I'd miss my 6 o'clock dinner because that's when my father closed the store. So that was a ritual. I watched it with Lyndon and Granville many, many times, over and over again. But the one thing that I do remember, because my mother seldom ever got mad at me, but I don't know how old I was, but 5 or 6, something like that. And Pinocchio was playing at Jonesy's Theater, which was only a stone's throw from where we lived. And for some reason, she gave in and decided to take me to see Pinocchio. It was a matinee. There wasn't many people there, thank God, because it went along fine until Geppetto and Pinocchio got swallowed by the whale, and I somehow or the other lost it and started crying and carrying on, and she couldn't get me to stop, so she grabbed me up and said, "We're getting out of here." And she says, "And we're not going to do this anymore either." But I can still remember, she never gave me a whipping or anything like that, but she was very upset that I think I embarrassed her. But anyway, back to my father's store briefly. He ran the A&P store from 1930 until A&P closed that franchise, and then he turned it into a pure food store and ran it until he retired in 1976. And one of my first chores, and this was done at home, candy in those days didn't come pre-bagged, pre-sealed, pre-anything. It was in a big box. And he'd have the boys send the boxes down to the house. I'd set up the table and the scales and the rubber gloves, or plastic gloves, I guess they were, weigh these things, and after you did so many, and you know how many chocolates, drops, or gumdrops, or whatever went in the bags, you could pretty well figure how many it took, and weighed them and sealed them, and then he'd come get the boys, take them back up and stock the shelves. But that was a sticky mess, I can tell you that. Sometimes it took quite a while to get it out from underneath your fingernails, even with gloves on. Also, he had me change prices on the stuff in the store. Well, anything that was in either an aluminum or a metal can, the only way to do it in those days was to take a wad of steel wool, rub the price off of it, get an ink marker, and reprice it. And I spent more time rubbing steel wool, rubbing the prices off of the thing. And then the older I got put into more jobs, because then I got to run in the cash register, which was fine until Friday nights. And on Friday nights, it was lined up from the cash register all the way back the first aisle, all the way across the meat department, and it was a mess. And thank God I had boys that would pack the stuff up while I ran the cash register. And he did most of his stuff, believe it or not, on credit. We had this whole stack of papers underneath with somebody's name on it, and they paid, and most of them paid by the week or bi-weekly or even monthly.
Is that right?
But he never ever lost a cent that I am aware of. Everybody was honest and paid their all I had to do was go to find their sheet and write down the prices and go from there, but, he did very well with that, and some of these people were very pleased that it worked out that way. But anyway, now I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, because from where we lived, and I'm gonna, let me see, okay. I was involved in God knows how many fires that took place in Mt Airy. And it's a wonder I wasn't totally in a mental institution, but anyway. Got the dates here because on April the 1st of 1955, and this was Ronnie's relative, you'd have to tell me, was it his grandfather, grandmother, Ori, and Minnie?
I think they were aunt and uncle.
Aunt and uncle, okay. I wasn't sure what the relation, and of course Citation or Elwood, whatever, they lived, there was one house in between our house and theirs. And on that night, the house burned. It caught fire in the front, and I think Ori went down and put in the call, and from what I can glean, because as I said, at that time I was only about 10 or 11, Ori and Elwood got out, but Minnie was severely injured and I believe died from her burns after the fact, not right away, but it was, and I can still remember that. All this stuff happens at nighttime. But anyway, that I did, several years ago I went back through all the Mt Airy community reporters to get all these dates, to make them so that I knew I had the stuff right. Anyway, then on May the 26th, 1961, at that time, that was when the Mt Airy Furniture and Appliance Warehouse, and if you all remember where that was, it was up on Park Avenue, right above the Flatiron Building. It was a rather large building. It caught fire in the middle of the night. And I remember Thelma Straw lived in the apartment over the Ford Garage down on Main Street. And I went down there and she says, "Come on up, sit, we might as well watch this thing burn." Oh, I need it, okay, but anyway. So I sat there and watched it. We kind of had, I guess you would say, a good time, but I didn't know what so anyway, then I married my husband Wayne, okay, and at that time, in between, my father had bought this duplex house. Happy and Louise had moved to Beale Street, and they lived in the lower part, and Wayne and I moved into where Happy and Louise had been, on the upper side of it. But I was also one of these, for years and years, bowled at the bowling alley over at Frog Smith's, but because I was only a couple blocks away, I walked over and walked home. And this one particular night, as I was walking home and I went past the furniture and appliance store, the old B.S. Dorsey store, I thought I smelled something that didn't smell right. And I can remember putting my stuff down and looking in the windows and looking down the side alleyway in between there and thinking, well, I don't see anything, and then I didn't smell it, so I went home. 2 or 3 hours later, that whole building was completely ablaze. And I guess Happy must have come down from up on Hill Street, and my father went up. They got on the roof of their buildings because they were adjacent to this thing with hoses. I didn't even know you could get out on the roof. I had no idea or where they got the hoses, but between the two of them, they managed to save both of their stores because there was nothing left of the store afterwards. So something had to have been going on while that I smelled this weird smell and just didn't see anything, but I went about it to turn in a fire alarm for something that I didn't know what was going on. I probably should have. But anyway, that one took place, and anyway, let's see here once. Yeah, the whole building, as I said, they did a wonderful job and got lucky with their fire hoses and all the sparks that were flying off of the Dorsey building. Nothing was disturbed on either of their stores. So let me see then, okay, by 1969, then I was married. I had 2 daughters. They're both sitting back there with one of my 7 grandchildren is there. I got 6 granddaughters and 1 boy. I'm kind of skipping over because after I graduated from high school, which was in 1958, 2 weeks later, I started working at the First National Bank of Mount Airy. And I worked there until I retired from there. But one of my jobs was to go back on Friday evenings to what they called posting. It was all the things that didn't apply to be either deposits or withdrawals. They were internal entries, and they had to be posted and they had to be called into Frederick. And so I had to go in a half hour before anybody else did and get this done and get them called in. However, that night it didn't happen because I was downstairs in the lower part of the bank. I had all my papers spread out, was there at the posting machine, and was ready to go, and the current went off. And I looked out the back window, because there was a drive-through back there, and it was all glass. I looked out the back window, and all I saw were smoke and flames, because the mill was on fire. And I was in there, and I knew nobody else could ever get it, and nobody else was gonna be coming back to work that night, that's for sure. So I thought, oh my gosh, I gathered up everything, threw it in the downstairs vault, locked it all up, found my way up the steps, because even though it was May, it was still dark at those steps. And I had a car that time, but I had parked it on the lot across the road, on the across Prospect Road, because you weren't supposed to park down behind because it was a drive-through. And I gotta get the heck out of here. I'm not staying here because it was just getting worse and worse. And so I got myself out of the bank and up to where I had parked my car, which was in the lower, I guess the southeastern side of the parking lot. And the heat was so intense from the fire, because it had started behind the actual mill by the railroad tracks and worked its way up. And I can remember Walter Spurrier and Skeeter Spurrier and Norman Esser and all trying to get the stuff out of the office, which was on the front street. I don't know how much of it they got out, because by that time there was nothing but solid fire engines everywhere you looked. And I don't know how much progress they made. I was only like 2 blocks from home, but I couldn't get there. And my car was parked, and the heat was so bad, I thought, I gotta move it to the other end of the lot or I'm gonna have blistered paint and my car's not gonna be any good. So I moved that, but I was stuck there for about 2 hours at least until dusk because I couldn't get out. The fire engines were all down Prospect, all down, up and down Main Street, and I was trapped. So finally, about dusk, one of them moved and I could get off the parking lot. So I made a left out of the parking lot. You can remember this, going down Buffalo Road, across Old Boone Road, down Woodville Road, 144, to South Main Street, and finally I got home. I was a wreck by that time. I mean, I thought, I don't think I slept at all that night. I thought, this is ridiculous. How do I get in the middle of all these messes? It's just incredible. Absolutely incredible. But anyway, I made it through all that, and let me see here. Okay. Then in 1969, Wayne and I moved up on Carroll Avenue, and you were talking about the hatchery. I can remember we sat in the backyard and watched when the hatchery burned. So here we go again, but at least it's far enough away that I know I'm not yeah, right.
Or you in the town's fire history.
I know. Believe me, I don't even touch a match anymore. Not at all. Not at all. Oh, golly. But and even though my father, when he sold the store, he sold it to Ronnie Boone, who ran it as a grocery for about a year and then turned it into a video store. But in 1982, that store had some damage done to it. It wasn't completely demolished, but there was a fire in there that did damage to it. And, the last one, which occurred, Wayne had passed away by this time, and my father too, so they don't know anything about this, but the fire that occurred on September the 2nd, 2007, which started in a pizza oven there in that one restaurant, burned the west side of Main Street down, which did include their two buildings, so even though they saved it years ago, it didn't save it then, they were gone. And somebody wanted me to go down and watch the fire. I said, ain't no way. I am not doing that. So we went out to breakfast somewhere and came back later that afternoon and then saw all the damage. And I'm thinking, well, I'm glad I didn't watch that. And I'm glad my father, nor Happy, nor any of these others saw what happened. But it's just so amazing that when Larry wrote that book called Fire, 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 I had gone through all the newspapers and made a list of all the fires that I either was in or near or knew something about, and I had a list that I kept for years, still do. But that's the main thing that I remember about being in Mt Airy. Now, granted, I was grown up toward the end of this thing, but thank goodness nothing like that happened when I was a child, or I'd have probably been scarred for life, I think. But that's my story. I'm still here. I'm still on Carroll Avenue. Nobody, I got the rest of my family, the younger ones here, but all the others are gone. And because my mother passed away a long time ago too. So, but that's it. That's my life. But it was kind of exciting. I kind of skipped over my school days because they were mundane compared to all I never got in trouble. I never got it was several years before I went back to the movies, but that was in Frederick when I used to spend time with my grandmother, and I could go in peace and not cry.
Well, thank you, Pat.